Let's talk about dopamine.
The neurochemical that causes you to self-distract, overeat, and waste hours on TikTok.
We're stuck in a dopaminergic cycle.
In this video, I want to talk about
YouTube, pornography, video games.
What are your thoughts on dopamine detoxing?
Dopamine detoxing will not work. Believe me, I've tried it. Dopamine, it's the chemical responsible for all our motivation, our drive, and ultimately what we crave. And today's world has left it utterly beaten to a pulp, and yet there's still some people who seem to crave doing the things we avoid. Now this got me curious, and so I've spent the last few weeks consuming every book, video, and study that I could get my hands on to find a real actionable framework to not only heal our brains, but also to start craving doing difficult shit. And it all starts with this. This is your brain. It also happens to be a lemon, but what it represents is the amount of dopamine that's in your brain when you first wake up in the morning. See, this is because when we are going through periods of absence of stimulation, or our body's given time to replenish, this is when our brain produces the dopamine that we're going to need to motivate ourselves to do things the following day. Now, this tragic thing is that what most people do is the instant that they gain consciousness, they reach for their magical rectangle. This thing has been designed by thousands upon thousands of software developers to squeeze this lemon as hard as humanly possible. Now, what this results in is lemons that end up looking like this, okay? No matter how hard you squeeze, you are going to end up only getting a little smidge of juice out of that lemon. Now, on the flip side, if instead you do what neuroscientists like TJ Power recommend, you'll spend an hour to 4 hours away from your phones, away from anything kind of hyper palatable and dopaminergic, and this gives your brain the chance to kind of produce more dopamine and kind of increase the size of your lemon. This means that not only are you going to be more motivated, but when you do finally engage in something that's pleasurable, you're going to get that much more joy from it. It's kind of like an intermittent dopamine fast, where you delay the intake of dopaminergic activities to later and later in the day to keep your motivation high and also your enjoyment at peak levels. But the truth is, if you're going to do that, you're going to be really bored. Jesus. But to understand that, I first need to admit something incredibly embarrassing. And that is that up until extremely recently, I have spent my entire life plugged in. I mean, every second of the day, I had some kind of input going on between my ears. Whether it be a video or a podcast, something was playing at all times. My thinking was that if I'm always learning, then I'm always intaking information, and that's going to be proved to be useful. But it turns out that that is completely the opposite of what's true. You see, whenever you are constantly receiving inputs, the default mode network of the brain is completely silenced. This is the part of the brain that's responsible for making connections from all the inputs we receive. What we experience as creativity is really just this part of our brain making connections in the background. As for our dopamine, this is the chance our brain gets to kind of take a breather and replenish the dopamine stores that it's lost throughout the day. And so if you are like me and have a tendency to just reach for whatever's stimulating, then it's worth taking a step back and remembering that boredom is our friend. This next rule isn't just the motto of your parents' swingers club, it's also a golden rule to keep your dopamine from falling off a cliff. And that is pain before pleasure. You see, pain and pleasure are situated as neighbors inside the brain, and the body is always going to try and keep us in equilibrium to kind of keep ourselves balanced. So when you do something pleasurable, the brain responds by immediately kicking you in the balls. You probably experience this when you take a bite of chocolate and you immediately get a craving as opposed to being satisfied. And the thing to remember is that the more we engage in pleasure, the higher the pain response from the brain that we're going to receive. And what Dr. Anna Lembke points out in her book Dopamine is that through the wonders of market capitalism, it's never been easier to stave off that pain. We've effectively eradicated boredom, and we can chase infinite pleasure at any time we want. But the problem is that Mother Nature is still very much undefeated.
So if we ingest a substance or engage in a behavior that causes a very large release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, our brains will immediately respond to that by downregulating our own dopamine production and our own dopamine transmission. They will put us into a dopamine deficit state. So it's not that we just go back to a level balance or homeostasis. We go below baseline dopamine levels. So if you think about dopamine firing, we're always firing at a tonic level, a baseline rate of dopamine. And dopamine goes up or down depending upon what we're doing. And it is what really governs our approach and avoidance behavior. But every time we have a big surge of dopamine upwards, there's a price to pay for that. And it is that dopamine levels then go below baseline to compensate for that before bringing dopamine back to our baseline tonic levels. And if you repeat that behavior again and again, the initial response to the stimulus gets weaker and shorter, and the after response, the dopamine deficit state, gets stronger and longer until you've essentially put yourself in a chronic dopamine deficit state.
Where you're always chasing the dragon.
That's right. And where when you're not doing that behavior or ingesting that substance, you are in basically something akin to a clinical depression. You're in a dopamine deficit state, so you feel lousy.
Now, the good news is that the balance also works the other way. When we do something that's painful or effortful, the brain responds by gifting us dopamine and pleasure. You've probably experienced this kind of euphoric feeling after a really hard workout or a long day of being productive. So the rule here is that we need to engage in something painful before we do something pleasurable. And I'm not suggesting that you go full Pulp Fiction and lock yourself in a box, but what I am saying is if you do something that's kind of effortful prior to engaging in anything that's kind of dopaminergic, it'll kind of offset this pain response and keep your dopamine kind of level as opposed to falling off a cliff. But then again, even if you do become a mini masochist, if you're not taking care of the boring fundamentals, well then you're gonna stay a gooper. Yes, unfortunately, I am gonna have to be the adult in the room and tell you that yes, the boring fundamentals do matter. You know, all of these tips and tricks, they work really well, but if you're sleeping like shit, eating like shit, and have the physical activity level of Asmongold, well then none of it's going to work, okay? Your brain physically will not have the resources to produce the dopamine that you need. Also, short form content is an absolute no-go. These kind of emotional changes constantly as you're scrolling through is literally just using up all of your dopamine reserves like that. That's why time feels like it's passing so quickly, because you're just using all of your motivation in one sprint. Now, for those of you who are interested, apparently these are the supplements that are supposed to help your brain to produce more dopamine. But to me, starting with these as opposed to everything else is kind of like buying 50 condoms before you even speak to a woman. There's not really much point. And so now we're on to the biggest lie that's told about dopamine, the dopamine detox. And it is one that I've fallen for one too many times. You see, the idea on its surface is kind of tantalizing and it kind of makes sense. You see, one of the major plagues of today's world is that we've artificially raised our baseline for what brings us pleasure, joy, and happiness through things like video games and fast food that have been artificially designed to, again, squeeze that lemon as hard as possible. And so it kind of makes sense that if you were to remove all these things for a period of time, our brain would eventually compensate by bringing down that baseline. The sad fact is, this rarely works out in practice. And this was demonstrated by a recent study that was done on smartphone use. So what they did was they took 3 cohorts of people and they went and they asked the first group to quit their phone cold turkey, no more use, no mas. The second group they asked to reduce their screen time by an hour a day. And then the third group was the control group, and so they were told nothing, they were cast aside. Now, something really interesting happened as a result of this study. It turned out that the group that ended up with the lowest screen time after the study ended was the 1 hour reduction group. And not only that, but a lot of the people who engaged in the study were smokers, and a lot of the people who were in the 1 hour reduction group ended up also quitting smoking as a result of doing the study, which was not seen in either of the other 2 groups. The theory is that the group that reduced their time by an hour a day gained a sense of agency. They realized that they could do more, and so they decided they were going to also just quit smoking. Whereas if you completely cut it out entirely, you kind of don't know what you can do. But the problem isn't even this lack of agency, and instead it's something that's far more obvious. You see, if your baseline is the problem, and the problem is that it's way up here, okay, and you want it to not be down here where you never consume anything again, you want it to be kind of here. You still want to be able to watch movies from time to time or eat some food that's not the best for you. You're not going to swear off it forever. And so the idea that you're going to go from here, where you're hyperstimulated all the time, and you've built up this kind of reserve of pain, and you're going to face that all head on all at once and go down to here and just be depressed, anxious, and a bit fucking miserable, only to then afterwards come up to hopefully here, but probably more likely rebound and go right back up, makes no sense. Even if you're successful, you could just cut out the middleman and instead just go from here and just reduce it here. Makes far more sense. And that way you're not having this insane pain. It's definitely more feasible, and as we've seen from the study, more people are going to do it over the long term. But just because dopamine detoxing isn't some hack for endless motivation, doesn't mean that there isn't one. You see, the world's top performers don't just do the things we mentioned in this video. They also have one trick that kind of releases this infinite dopamine loop. They get endless motivation towards their goal to the point where they're going to work and work and work at it until they either achieve it or they die trying. And I'll warn you, it's powerful, but it's not without its downsides. Tell me this, what do these three people have in common? If you said they're all white, well then you're not very good at this game and you probably need glasses. The real answer is that these people are all famous for having an ungodly work ethic, and they've all also told us the reason why.
That was when I kind of refined my kind of theory of living for me, which is that hard work is the goal. And so it's not like work hard so that X, because as soon as you have a so that, then the X is the thing. But if the goal is to work as hard as you possibly can, then the only real output we have is who we become along the way. And so in reframing that, then it's something that I can win or measure myself against every day in real time throughout the day, which is how hard am I working? Because that is the goal. And then even I say this just for audio, but like everything else takes care of itself, still puts the everything else as the goal still. It's just being vaguer. But if you just say like, the only point is working hard because I know that whatever I'm going to get is stuff that I will become accustomed to.
If I wanted to, I could just not build a snack brand. I could just not do a restaurant, and I could just not do a mobile game company, and I could just not do gaming, a gaming channel and a React channel. And I could just do my main channel. I'd probably be way happier and have way more free time, but that's just not who I am. And it sounds weird, but it's just ingrained in me. Those are the things that like get me up and get me out of bed. And like when I don't do them, I'm depressed. So I like pushing myself, and I see it as a sport and like going hard in business and building them.
See, what they've done is they've tricked their brains into suggesting that the pursuit of pain itself is the reward. Okay, what they're aiming for is the pain. And so as a result of that, this creates this kind of infinite dopamine flywheel. You see, the pain, as we talked about before, produces dopamine, which then motivates them to pursue more pain, which produces dopamine, and so on and so on and so on. And so there's three potential outcomes to them achieving their goal, which is either they achieve their end goal, they burn out, or they die. That's it. Now, as I said, this isn't without its downside, and the downside is that these people become so drawn to this thing, so addicted to their work, workaholics, that they ignore literally everything else that matters in their life. Or as Jason Pargin put it, your heroes aren't gods. They're just regular people who got really good at one thing by sacrificing literally everything else. And if that sounds good to you, then you best get to work.
Ride with me if you ride with me, you can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky, come get high with me.